What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel. I have another Oakensoul 1-bar build for you that I figured I'd just post on top of the other one that went up yesterday rather than waiting until next week. I've been having a lot of fun with this one. It's a 1-bar heavy attack sorcerer for a PvP setting. I think it shines best in battlegrounds or Imperial City, but you could probably do okay in Cyrodiil too. I was kind of just messing around with different setups and trying to figure out how this would work. Ran into a wall for a little bit, but I think the end result is really fun and a unique build. You can slap on a pre-existing heavy attack sorcerer that you're running already, maybe as a secondary setup at your build station to get some daily battlegrounds matches under your belt. I usually tend to stay away from battlegrounds because I can always feel my blood pressure raising, and it sort of takes me back to the old days of Counter-Strike and Halo. But like I said, it's been a lot of fun. Enough jabber from me. We're going to want to run this setup on a Dark Elf or a High Elf, maybe a Khajiit. Anything else that you have would work just fine with a little bit less damage. We're going to use the Lover as our Mundus Stone, or if you'd prefer, you could also use the Apprentice if you feel like you're really underperforming on damage. I find better results from the extra penetration from the Lover, which, by the way, I still think is hilarious that the Lover and penetration go hand in hand, or something in something. Our food is going to be Witch Mother's Potent Brew. If you're able to afford it, you could use Clockwork Citrus Fillet or maybe Smoked Bear Haunch for the extra bit of stamina recovery. For attribute points, we've placed 50 into Magicka and the remaining 14 into health. We want to be pretty tanky here, especially when you compare this setup with the normal PvE version using more medium pieces, so the extra bit of health will help us out on that front and prevent us from being too squishy. Our two sets are going to be Sergeant's Mail and Night Slayer. Sergeant's Mail can be looted from the Wayrest Sewers dungeons, both the first and second iterations. So if you don't have the pieces you need, you can just run those dungeons over and over until you loot what you're missing, and then just take those items to a transmute station and pay with crystals to get them into the proper trait, as you can afford to do so. We're going to wear Sergeant's Mail on our chest, our shoulders, our hands, our legs, and our feet. We'll want the biggest piece, our chest, to be reinforced, and you can also go reinforced on the legs since they're also a large piece. The shoulders, hands, and feet can be impenetrable. With a setup like this, we can simultaneously improve our armor rating along with buffing up our critical resistance, so we'll be much harder to take down than the usual sorcerer that lives in Squishville. Sergeant's Mail gives us a little bit of max health and health recovery, adds to our spell damage, and then gives us stacks of Sergeant's Focus when we land heavy attacks, which increases the damage our heavies do with each stack. Our other main set, Night Slayer, is a PvP set that can be won as rewards in battlegrounds. So if you don't feel like grinding those pieces out, you can always purchase them from a guild trader and upgrade and transmute them as you can afford to. This set adds to our max Magicka and health, gives us some spell damage, and also deals an additional 8% of our enemies' max health as Oblivion damage when we hit them with a fully charged heavy attack. This is somewhat controversial to be using as a set because the ESO community tends to act as a hive mind and only uses the same 2 or 3 sets in any given activity in the game. But as a Chad and a 1-bar bro, I feel a patriotic duty to stand up against the establishment and try something new. Anyways, to give a tiny bit more info, this set is somewhat comparable to Stormmaster, which we use in PvE builds of this sort, but the main difference is that we aren't stacking up critical chance. With Night Slayer, we deal Oblivion damage with a full set equipped. Oblivion damage is a type of magic damage that can't be resisted by any damage reduction effects, nor is it subject to critical strikes. So this is why we aren't running a critical setup with the Thief as our Mundus Stone and stacking critical chance with Stormmaster in an attempt to chase huge critical blows. This certainly can be done, but I find much better results with Night Slayer and the Oblivion damage system. So with this set, 8% of the enemy's health is dealt to them as Oblivion damage. That is unblockable damage that can't be resisted by any damage reduction effects. So if we assume that the average PvP enemy has something like 21,000 health, we'll be dealing an additional 1,680 Oblivion damage with each heavy attack, regardless of it being a critical or not, as Oblivion damage itself isn't going to scale up with a critical. This amount of oblivion damage scales up with the ceiling being on a player with 100,000 health, which is a very rare situation, so you can pretty much be sure that you won't be wasting any potential of this effect on anyone that you attack. We're going to be wearing Night Slayer on our belt in Divines with a max Magicka glyph, and then as a ring and a necklace, both as Bloodthirsty with spell damage enchantments. And the same goes for our Oakensoul ring as well. Our Lightning Staff is going to be Precise with a weapon damage enchantment for a very simple and straightforward playstyle. Alternatively, you could use a glyph of Decrease Health for some additional oblivion damage. It's up to you at the end of the day. Both setups work about the same. I like the weapon damage glyph personally, so I've stuck with that for the time being. Our monster piece is going to be a heavy Slimecraw helmet from the Veteran Wayrest Sewers dungeon. We'll want this to be reinforced with a prismatic glyph, which we'll also want on all of our other armor pieces as well, aside from our light belt, which we can do Divines with max Magicka to get a little bit of boost to our magical pool there. The prismatic glyphs can be expensive, so if you're low on funds, you can always just use a mixture of health, stamina, and Magicka and get by just fine. The ideal setup would include all prismatic as I have here, but don't sweat it too much if you're broke. Just use what you have and get on with playing. One alternative set that would be worth picking up if you are Night Slayer phobic would be Hist Whisperer. This one can be crafted in the Blackwood zone and gives you some health, stamina, and Magicka recovery on top of giving you back health with your heavy attacks. Something like this would work well for sustain and survivability, but you'll be dealing less damage. At the end of the day, you'll sort of be making a choice between being a tanky damage boy or being a tanky not so damage boy that can survive longer. Both setups would work out well, so depending on your personal playstyle, there's just another option for you to consider. Another option could potentially be Mechanical Acuity, which you can craft in the Clockwork City zone. If you don't have access, you can always just ask someone to craft it for you or buy the pieces. This one gives you some extra stamina and Magicka, a little boost to your spell damage, and then when you deal non-critical damage, you gain a stack of Mechanical Acuity for 4 seconds, which grants you 20% critical chance per stack up to once every second, stacking up to 5 times. When you get max stacks or the effect ends, you can't proc it again for 25 seconds, so keep that in mind. And then one other set that could potentially work well here would be Deadly Strike. This one is looted from Cyrodiil or alternatively purchased from a guild trader and gives us extra spell damage, some critical chance, and also increases the damage that our damage over time and channeled abilities do by 15%. This may seem counterintuitive since all of our skills on the bar are instant, but the streams of lightning that build into our single heavy attacks are considered channeled abilities. So those little ticks of damage that build up into a heavy attack would be increased by 15% if you were using this set. So just keep it in mind and go collect some of the pieces of it if it sounds like it would be more enjoyable for you to play that way. And if you're sick of using Slimecraw helmets on every DPS setup, you could also use something else like Valken Scoria to buff up penetration, or maybe even Balorg for a little more spell damage. At the end of the day, we do want to buff up our critical chance enough to ensure that we'll get some amount of criticals to land, but like I mentioned earlier, that isn't our main goal with this build.
My main goal is to blow up and then act like I don't know nobody.
Champion points would normally be brought up now, but since this is mainly meant for battlegrounds, it doesn't really matter what you have slotted. But if you do want to run this in Imperial City or Cyrodiil campaigns with CP enabled, I would suggest something like this for a setup. In the blue tree, I would start out with Weapons Expert, Fighting Finesse, Deadly Aim, and Wrathful Strikes. You may find that Reaving Blows helps to keep you alive, or you may find that Master at Arms works better for you than Fighting Finesse, so make any swaps that you need to as you feel it out. In the red tree, I would use Boundless Vitality, Fortified, Sustained by Suffering, and Bastion. I think this is the optimal setup for the red section, but again, if there's something else that you like better, you can always make swaps. The extra recovery that we get from Sustained by Suffering makes enough of a difference to keep slotted here, especially when we're struggling with Stamina Sustain, and the damage shield buff from Bastion is a no-brainer. The green tree doesn't matter much, but if you're out in open world PvP, you'll want to run something like Warmount, Gifted Rider, Steed's Blessing, and Rationer, maybe Liquid Efficiency. A quick rundown of the passive abilities you'll want to get. So we'll want all of the armor passives from Light and Heavy. We'll want to specifically get Unholy Knowledge and Persistence from the Dark Magic skill line. We'll want everything from Daedric Summoning and Storm Calling, everything from Destruction Staff, and everything from Racial as well. You can go ahead and get anything you want from Undaunted and the other guilds, along with Alliance War and Craft. And finally, we'll get to the skill bar. So the first slot is going to be Empowered Ward. This acts as a nice damage shield for ourselves and our pet, while also giving our allies minor intellect and minor endurance, which grants them some additional magicka and stamina recovery. Our next skill is going to be the Spiked Bone Shield from Undaunted. This one is a stamina-based damage shield that absorbs and redirects 95% of the damage done to it, while also providing a synergy that allows our team members to get their own damage shields as well. So if you feel like you don't need both of these damage shield abilities, pick the one you like less and swap it out with something else like Streak for mobility. You can never go wrong there. Or maybe one of the morphs of Vigor, so you can have a heal over time happening constantly. Our third skill is going to be Haunting Curse. This one casts a destructive rune on a single enemy that blows up once for a nice burst of damage, and then a second time after 8.5 seconds. Both of these will also damage the enemy team if they are standing nearby, so it pairs nicely with our splash damage that our Lightning Staff heavy attacks provide when we're fighting against a team that's all standing together in a tight group. Our fourth skill is going to be our Execute, Mage's Wrath. We cast this when a super low health enemy tries to run away. It's powerful, and it's also easier to target when someone tries to round a corner or use the environment to avoid damage when you compare it to a heavy attack. It also synergizes perfectly with the area damage explosions from Haunting Curse and the splash damage from our heavy attacks. So we're always focusing on a single target, but we're passively dealing bursts of damage to any group members that are near them at the same time, which helps out the other people on our team by squishing up the opposition just a little bit. And then our pet is going to be the Twilight Matriarch Bird Lady. As always, she acts as a healer on demand that we can use on ourselves as well as on our team members. She sends out a tiny bit of damage herself while acting as cover for us to use to our advantage in PvP settings. The ultimate ability will really just be a choice between Ice Comet or Shooting Star and Greater Storm Atronach. These both act very well as finishers or as a way to burst down an entire group of enemies, and all of them have their own advantages and disadvantages. I personally prefer Shooting Star because you get ultimate back when you hit larger groups and you can use it more often. Ice Comet is great because it adds a bit of damage and movement speed reduction to those that you hit, but if you can't be bothered to grind out the Mages Guild skill line, Storm Atronach will work just fine. Surely you could use something like Barrier or Negate here, but we're going on the offensive for the most part, so unless you're specifically trying to play some sort of a support role, I would use a damaging ability 99% of the time. It never hurts to unlock other ultimates, so you can swap things around depending on the loadouts of the other team. So keep your options open and just try to pay attention to what's happening in your matches so you can adjust things as you need to. Onto our rotation, we want to ensure that we always have our damage shields up, especially when we're about to enter into a fight. Empowered Ward lasts for 10 seconds, so we'll cast that first and follow up with a Bone Shield. You'll want to start fights by next casting your Haunting Curse on an unsuspecting victim, and then doing your best to target them until they are dead with heavy attacks and your Execute. If someone runs away, you don't have to go chasing them necessarily, since our setup tends to work best in situations where the opposing team is somewhat grouped together. That isn't to say you can't take someone out in a 1v1 situation, because you will probably be able to take on most other players, but you'll shine more and rack up more points when going after groups. When someone goes under 20% health, be sure to spam your Execute and use the Naked Bird Lady whenever you or your team needs to top up on health. The most important things to keep in mind, since we're trying to keep this as simple as possible, would be to keep up your damage shields, keep ripping heavy attacks, curse single targets, and try to focus them while not beating yourself up if they run away, because you're still assisting with some passive damage from your curse. Spam Mage's Wrath when someone's low, and don't forget about your ultimate. It can be easy to think that you need to save up your ultimate, but at the end of the day it's there to be used, so don't be afraid to use it, because it'll recharge before you know it. Keep your potions in mind, don't be afraid to use them, since you probably have at least 1,000 of them saved up in your bank, and be sure to resummon your Naked Bird Lady when she gets taken out. A bonus note, if you're fighting against an enemy that has a pet, like a Naked Bird Lady or a bear, You can blast that pet with heavy attacks and apply splash damage to their owner via the Tri-Focus passive from the Destruction Staff skill line. This tends to work well in situations where someone is using their pet as cover, because they won't really be expecting you to be using heavy attacks and are really just used to being able to hide behind their pet. This also works well in content that has monsters in the same areas as players, like in the Imperial City or guards in a keep in Cyrodiil. If you wanted to truly focus 100% of your effort on doing this cheeky move, you could probably use a set like Noble Duelist to buff up those heavy attacks even further. Unfortunately, Noble Duelist's effect only applies to monsters, so you would pretty much have to constantly go out of your way to specifically target monsters rather than players. And since that isn't a super common situation, we didn't really go there in this build, but for a meme situation, that would absolutely be viable. Alright, that's all I've got for this one. I hope you enjoyed and can figure out a way to apply this to your own heavy attack builds to expand the types of content that you can participate in without being too much of a sweatlord. I haven't tested this out on other classes yet, but I'm sure it can be done with a similar effect. So I would imagine I'll be running some tests trying to see if I can get this to work on some of my other characters in the future. Be sure to like the video and sub to the channel so you can stay in the loop, and be sure to check the description for info on joining the One Bar Bros Guild if you're on the North American PC server. Until next time.